Industrial Revolution.
Hi everybody, thanks very much for coming to listen to all of us talk today. I will be talking a bit but also showing you pictures, which I think is what you need early in the morning or late at night. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, can everybody see that? Yeah. Okay, this is just the blurb, so you know that our funding, as Joanne diligently told you, for her project is from the HRC. It's part of a project with Kate Gibson, who's on this call, but also Jeremy Gregory and our former PDRA, Caris Brown, who's gone on to a research fellowship now in Cambridge. So this is a joint project from all of us, a team project, I should say. Now, one of the things we've been looking at in this project of the religious lives of ordinary people in the 18th and early 19th century is religion in the home. And within that study, I've been looking quite a lot at material culture, and that includes books. Our examination of religious books that were kept in northern urban homes suggests that these were objects that could both demonstrate religious belief and help to sustain and shape it. Such books can also be understood as emotional objects whose values stem from their embodiment of the emotions of individuals and groups, as well as to the specific context in which they were used as religious symbols, prompts, and mnemonics. All these characteristics, I think, allow us to use religious books as a way to explore domestic and familial religious practice, and to consider the ways in which religious objects might not just be the recipients of human agency, but might act themselves on those that used or viewed them. And I'd love it if we talked a bit more about that later. Such objects could work upon individuals in the past in a number of ways as items of display with visual and textual messages to encourage particularly intimate haptic devotional practices involving touching and handling, and to demonstrate the familial piety to visitors from outside the household. Now, as all of us know from all the objects that we're talking about today, books often bear the physical traces of their ownership and use, not just in terms of inscription or when the text or images within books inspired annotation and comment, but also as repositories for other sorts of information, often highly personal, or as sites of other uses, such as places to scribble and practice one's signature. As objects, they often carry the marks of wear and tear resulting from long use and careless treatment, as long as marks produced by attempts to repair damage and to improve appearance and longevity, such as rebinding. Now, as I'm sure all of you will be familiar with, recording family lineage in Bibles and other religious books was common. The Scott family of Hull's copy of the History of the Old and New Testament, 3rd edition, London 1703, contained detailed family information and was inscribed with a list of births and deaths on the verso of plate 142, the recto carrying an image of the prophet Isaiah's vision of the angels. Here, Joseph Scott or his wife Mary recorded the birth of their son Samuel on the 11th of April 1748 at 9 o'clock at night, his subsequent death on the 19th of November of the same year betwixt 12 and 1 o'clock at night, followed by the birth of twins Joseph and Benjamin 2 hours apart in 1750. A diminutive Bible published in Edinburgh in 1736 was given to a young Andrew Irvine in 1761 by his stepfather, Robert Richardson, with both facts proudly recorded in the inside front cover and front flyleaf recto by the new owner. Other family dates are recorded in blank passages throughout the volume, with the inside back cover used for Latin exercises, whilst the marks of intensive study appear throughout the volume, with the inside back cover particularly scribbled on. In 1794, William married Anne Hanson in Wakefield, with a son, also William, born the following year. Sorry, that William is Andrew's son, at 11 o'clock at night, as recorded in an empty flyleaf, and baptized near Halifax. Bibles are not the only places to record important family dates. the Cousins family of Sheffield, who were silversmiths, headed by Isaac and Mary Cousins, used their copy of John Foxe's Great Martyrology, The Acts and Monuments, Foxe's Book of Martyrs, published in 1593, so a very old book that they must have inherited or bought for this purpose. I'm not showing you the list of family dates here, but I'm showing you a page from another part of this book. The book is full of marks of serious study, but it's also full of doodles and scribbles like this, which I think you can probably see around the sack. Some of the marks are in pen like this, some in graphite. I think these circular doodles look suspiciously like they've been done by a childish hand, but we can think about that. And the existence of different types of annotations suggests that this book was both used for very serious study, as a place to record crucial family information, but also as a site for less earnest pursuits. Another Sheffield family Bible belonging to the Barnsley family of cutlers is also full of seemingly irreverent and childish markings, with examples of doodles, drawings, ink spills, and handwriting practice made between 1745 and 1770. I love these pictures of the dogs at the top here. Inscriptions by the siblings Mary Barnsley, George Barnsley, Jasper and John Barnsley appear on all its pages in what almost looks like a competitive marking exercise of the book. These annotations suggest that this volume, in common with others, was used both for pious study as well as less lofty pursuits by both adults and children. You also find things like calculations in adult hands quite often in religious books. I think this makes it likely that these books were both accessible to all or most members of the household for serious study, for devotional practice and meditation, but also used for playful and bored jottings. To end on, this is the picture that I started with because I love it so much. And more childish markings in a copy of a miniature book explicitly aimed at a young audience, an abridgment of the Bible or a near way to Christian knowledge for the use of children. This was published in Sheffield in 1789, and this particular copy, held in Leeds, was owned by John Hurst of Dewsbury, who marked it as his book, 1793. The book contains a particularly striking drawing of a ship that John drew at the end of the book of Jonah, no doubt inspired by the tale. Here we see a child engaging directly with a Bible story through the act of drawing. As other marks in this book indicate, sorry, I'm gonna have a quick drink. Not gin. Though his owner may well have viewed this as a spiritual text with which he could engage directly, as an object is emphatically not seen as untouchable. Like the other annotations in childish and adult hands that we found, they demonstrate the degree to which religious books in domestic settings appear to have been sacred texts that were important and highly valued. It's one of the reasons you record your family information in them, because they're valuable and less likely to be lost or given away, as well as being familiar objects with which household members could freely engage and upon which they could make their mark in a variety of ways. So these are at once holy objects that would have been consulted regularly by adults and children as part of religious study and family readings, as well as everyday items for less serious activities that were freely accessible and not necessarily kept apart from some members of the household. As objects, they encouraged those who read, touched, or wrote on them to think deeply and often about their faith. The very presence of religious books, and the Bible in particular, in domestic spaces, and their easy accessibility meant that they can be seen as active objects in the promotion of familial piety and religious reflection. Their marked pages and worn covers a witness to their everyday use and their importance, not simply because of the text that they contained, but also because they allowed individuals to touch, hold, and even make one's mark upon the world, the word of God. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that and for those insights into those lovely family Bibles. I do also love that picture of the ship. Okay, thank you. So we will turn next to Kath Feely. So Kath is a senior lecturer in history at the University of Derby. She is a modern British cultural historian. Her published work to date has largely been on working class reading and writing practices and the history of the press in both the 19th and 20th centuries. And amongst other things, she's written about the role of annotating and passing down radical books in the political. She's now working broadly on the history of public history, especially the civic use of heritage in interwar Britain. And she is also considering writing something about her family history, for which we are very grateful, and that brings her here today. Thank you, Kath. Over to you.
Right, let me just start this. Can you see that? Yeah?
Yes.
Good, okay. So until I was 16, my entire world was Catholic. I must have met people who weren't Catholic, but certainly not knowingly. And the person probably most responsible for this state of affairs was my maternal grandmother, Marjorie Drummond, photographed here, holding me at the party after my christening at the Easter Vigil in April 1981, when I was saved from the fate of purgatory at a mere 10 days old. It was strange then when I realised, and I'm not sure when I realised, that the most Catholic person in my entirely Catholic world hadn't always been Catholic. The small, unremarkable Bible that I'm talking about today, her Bible, predates her conversion from the Church of England to Roman Catholicism on marriage to my grandpa, John Drummond, in 1940. It is not, as we shall see, itself a Catholic object, but it was made so over a period of nearly 60 years, becoming a repository hinting at the tumultuous changes to, but also the continuities of, Catholic religious lay practice over the course of the second half of the 20th century. But it's also an opportunity for me to reflect on my mother's relationship with her mother and her religion, which were deeply intertwined, and by extension, my relationship with both of them and my own faith, or lack of it. So Marjorie Rose Platt was born into a relatively comfortable middle-class home in the South Manchester suburb of Burnage in 1919. Her father, George Platt, was a furniture dealer. And although he died young when she was 9, he left a shop that remained in the family until the 1990s on Rochdale Road, if anyone's from Manchester. So her mother, Doris Platt, remarried a man who I only know as Uncle Tom, that both Marjorie and her brother Wilf adored. Now, I know shockingly little about her life before meeting Grandpa, except what I see in this Bible, printed by the British and Foreign Bible Society in 1932 and given to her and inscribed by her beloved head teacher, Miss Shepherd, at the Acacia School in Burnage, where when she left school in July 1933. Now, some local history reminiscences about Burnage in this period on the web claim that Acacia's pupils were seen as, or thought themselves to be, posh, which fits Nana's description completely, although she would have probably called it having high standards. So the inscription is brief but heartfelt, and at the bottom is a reference to Numbers 6, verses 24 to 26. The thin ribbon bookmark of the Bible is helpfully placed on these verses to reveal the message. The Lord bless thee and keep thee. The Lord make his face shine upon thee and be gracious unto thee. The Lord lift up his countenance upon thee and give thee peace. This Bible then was given to my Nana as she was becoming a woman. taking up work as a telephonist at a steelworks in Earlham, which was where she eventually met her husband. So this picture of her taken in 1937 is the most relaxed photograph of my nana that I've ever seen. And I guess it was before the dual burden of Catholicism and motherhood, and she had 5 children. She converted for marriage, as I said, as many women did in that period, as mixed marriages were frowned upon. But she had been reportedly a very devout member of the C of E, going to multiple services weekly. And my mother reports that it was a very big step to start taking the classes to convert to the rites of the Roman Catholic Church, and that her mother Doris was not very pleased about it. But the 5 objects that I'm going to very quickly show and tell in the next few minutes show not only her genuine belief as a Catholic, but also investment in the parish church as a community, and a community in which she and her family had influence and respect. So the first object is this. It's a remembrance of the mission preached by a Redemptorist father. So this is a memorial of a sermon that was given at St. Bernard's, Manchester in Burnage, and this was a very new church in 1947. What strikes me about this is not only is it very fire and brimstone, but also it's about the family, and it's about how the family are supposed to do all the daily acts of family and home Catholicism outside of the service. And the other thing that strikes me is that it was preached, this sermon, literally days before the birth of my mother, my nana's eldest child, who was born on the 26th of February, 1947. So she was very heavily pregnant as she was listening to this sermon. Object 2 completely sums up my nana in so many different ways. I guess it's an inspirational quotation on a bookmark from Saint Teresa of Avila, which echoes one of her favourite phrases, said often to children and grandchildren: "There is no such word as can't." She just constantly would say this, and I think this is really shown in this bookmark. And this is placed, and I can't decide whether this is relevant or whether I've just read too much Margaret Atwood to overlook it. This is placed in Genesis, where Laban pursues Jacob, who had married his daughters, both of them, Leah and Rachel, and fled, and catches up with them at Gilead, asking, "What can I do today unto these my daughters, or unto the offspring that they have borne?" Before the 2 men make a covenant over the women. They don't involve the women, they make a covenant over the women. Object 3 is a newsletter written to the women of St. Bernard's by the parish priest at the time in 1965. This newsletter really thanks them for all the fundraising that they have been doing in order to buy all the elements of the church that was relatively new, so the altar, for example. But it also announces the election as president of Mrs. John Drummond, for Burnside Drive president, who is my nana. And she felt very, very strongly and proud of this role. And in fact, we still have her badges that she wore that says that she was president of this. So arguably the pinnacle of lay Catholic womanhood, I would say, in that parish at that time. Object 4 is a scrap of paper with typewritten verse of a school hymn. In fact, it's a school hymn of my mother's, the convent school, the Hollies in Didsbury in Manchester, where she and her sisters went to grammar school. This hymn is all about youth and the promise of youth and the importance of keeping it holy and so forth. And I think it's really significant, especially when Hannah was thinking about all all the children using these the Bible. My nana obviously did not let her children anywhere near this Bible. This was very much hers, but there are traces of them in there. So I don't know if you can see, but on the back of this school hymn, my mother's handwriting is sums. So she was obviously doing a maths homework and doing this. And I think that this also sort of reflects the relationship between my nana and my mother, and their very different ideas of Catholicism. This is my mum, Jacqueline Drummond, later Feely, around about 1967, when she was training to be a teacher at, you won't be surprised, Catholic college in Liverpool. And my mum is very much a product of liberal Catholicism, very different to my nana, very much that post-Vatican II movement. And I just think it's really interesting that you have this sort of celebration of youth alongside the sort of very different Catholicism that my nana had. And finally, the final object in this Bible is a memorial card for the parish priest that was the parish priest when she became president of the Union of Catholic Mothers. And this is placed, and I think very deliberately, at John 15, which is the speech, the sermon to the disciples, where Jesus tells them that this is my commandment, that ye love one another as I have loved you. I'm going to try not to cry now, but my mother told me last night on the phone that those words, love one another as I have loved you, were actually my nana's final words to her children when they were at the bedside at her death in hospital, in Withington Hospital. So the upshot of this then. So as a historian, I can read Nana's Bible in the context of mid-20th century English Catholicism to tell a story of female devotion in a rapidly changing world. On reading Alana Harris's Faith and the Family very recently, which is a study of modern lay English Catholicism, mainly based on evidence from the Diocese of Salford, our diocese, I came the closest I have ever come to seeing my background reflected in modern British historiography. I can only imagine it being like a working class scholarship boy reading E.P. Thompson in the 1960s, the feeling that someone finally sort of gets it. But I am not just a historian. I am first a daughter, the daughter of Marjorie's daughter and the receiver of Holy Communion at the very altar rail that she fundraised to buy. And in the course of preparing this talk, I began to suspect that Nana, as she did everything, had placed these objects in her Bible very deliberately, each conversing with the passages around them to tell a story of continuity, of female determination as well as subjugation, of joy and sorrow, youth, aging, and the necessity of death, a story above all of mothers and daughters. Thank you very much, and I will leave you with the inspirational quotation from my Nana to take you through the day. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Kath. It was tremendously moving, and of course yes, I can see why you would be very moved when finding that out and trying to convey that. So well done on not yes, getting too emotional, but no, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. Okay, so we will move on now to our third talk. This is Debs Maguire. Deborah Maguire is completing a Masters by Research at Oxford Brookes. I'm very pleased to be one of her supervisors. The thesis is titled Remember Me, Domestic Textiles in Britain 1790 to 1890, Memory, Identity and Emotion. And it situates objects made at home, such as embroideries and quilts and coverlets, as items of emotional communication and selfhood. Deb is also the director of the Quilters Guild of the British Isles and an advisor to its museum collection of historical textiles. and she's a practitioner making and exhibiting modern quilts which draw on rich British tradition of making. And today she's going to, well, it's interesting because we've had mothers, grandmothers, and now we are going to have aunts. And her talk is called Maintaining the Importance of Aunts, Textiles, Emotions and the Matrilineal Family. So over to you, Debs. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen. Hopefully you can see that. Thank you. That was really interesting, Kath. As a married Maguire, so married into a very Irish Catholic family, that was a fascinating talk for me personally as well. Thank you, Joanne. So my presentation today is entitled Maintaining the Importance of Aunts. I'm interested in quilts and domestic textiles and how they were used as items of emotional communication, both within the family and between generations. So today I'm going to explore a series of inherited quilts, which were overlooked or misattributed at some point, to show how new analysis demonstrates the emotional work that they did between generations. I've chosen to highlight the less explored relationship of aunts and nieces, a mutual bond which affected the routes which inherited needlework objects travelled within families. Aunts' instructional role in needlework practice also impacted how objects were perceived by their nieces in the next generation. And the quilts which I share in today's presentation were made or gifted by women in later life, and were women without a living child to entrust with their inheritance. And thus their nieces became pivotal as repositories of the items and of their meaning and memory. In 1815, Jane Austen wrote to her niece Fanny, "I have always maintained the importance of aunts." And to her 12-year-old niece Caroline, she wrote that now you are become an aunt, you are a person of some consequence. Jane might well say so. She was eventually an aunt to 30 nieces and nephews, and her own aunts were significant figures in her life. Her aunt Pero Lee is a particular favourite of mine. She was jailed for shoplifting haberdashery in Bath. The role of aunt could be consequential. Biographers tend to emphasise Austen's encouragement of her niece's writing, but an extant needle case, which you can see on the slide there, made for her niece Louisa and inscribed with the words "with Aunt Jane's love," demonstrates that writing was not the only form of self-expression which Jane sought to encourage. Sociologists such as Robert Millado describe in the aunt a role which might meld that of mother and that of friend and confidant, a powerful combination of influence on the values of a young relation. Jane was a proficient needlewoman, and she and her sister Cassandra produced a complex extant quilt, which you can see on the right-hand side of the screen there, now at the museum at Chawton. An oppositional narrative between women's use of the pen and the needle prevailed, yet the reality was that both could be wielded as tools of self-expression, and Jane encouraged this skill in her nieces through her provision of tools such as the needlebook and through her own example sewing beside them. Alongside her written words, Jane's quilt was preserved by her nieces within the family until its inclusion in the museum. Quilts are particularly potent items. Long made, taking many months or even years to complete, as they are made and used, they often become invested with emotional significance, with layers of meaning which evolve through generations. Whilst domestic needlework was ubiquitous in the past, some families and individuals went further to attribute values of legacy to the items which they made. These enhanced emotional associations can then be traced through generations. For example, families such as the Huttons, upwardly mobile nonconformists from the Midlands. By following these matrilineal threads of meaning, we can uncover cross-generational emotional communities of shared values and their expression in stitched items. The diarist Catherine Hutton, who you can see on the slide here, wrote on August the 1st, 1779, when she was 23 years old, of her visit to her aunt in Nottingham. She said, "I called on my Aunt Perkins, who promised me a calico bed quilt that was a gown and petticoat of my grandmother's, made me a cap." In this brief diary entry, she reveals a female tradition of textile keeping in the generations before her, and in the making of a future promise of the item, Aunt Perkins stresses the quilt's emotional value and the responsibility of its preservation. As Catherine records the event in her diary, she anticipates being handed the proverbial baton of inheritance to take forward. Objects such as the patchwork quilt exist as palimpsests of memory and legacy, which can do work in one generation but be reimagined again in the next. The quilt is described as a reworking of an older dress textile, and perhaps associated with youthful memories for grandmother Anne, who wore it as a girl. It is not clear who made the gown into a quilt. Whose memories does this piece really preserve? Anne's memory of her youth, Aunt Perkins' memory of her mother, or does it go on to become Catherine's of her grandmother? The calico bed quilt described in the diary entry remarkably resurfaced publicly at the Quilters Guild Heritage Search in 1993. This was an event like the Antiques Roadshow, where the public were invited to bring items along for people, for experts to look at. Its current owner identified herself as the great niece of Catherine Hutton, and she brought it along to an open day in Hereford. Strategic gifting within families occurred, passing items on to female legatees in the next generation, who were felt most likely to preserve and recognise the value of a textile. Some wills overtly reference this emotional calculation, offering money or other items as a proxy when the quilt is bequeathed elsewhere. By passing items across direct patrilineal inheritance lines, objects may have been judged to have a greater chance of physical survival, but their emotional significance might become lost in the complexity of the family tree. In 1993, the Hutton quilt still contained a note written by Catherine in 1839 and stitched to the back, which read, "The outside of this bed quilt was a dress called a suit of clothes worn by Anne Hutton, my grandmother, about 1715. I believe it to be Indian chintz. The cuffs and robing were of green silk. The counterpane in its present state was given to me by my Aunt Perkins in preference to her other nieces, because she said I should take care of it. She was not mistaken. Catherine Hutton, September 15, 1839. It is significant that as she contemplated her own legacy at the age of 83, Catherine Hutton took over action to write this label to preserve an oral story told to her as a young woman. Catherine also died without issue, and in creating this label, she preserved the memory of the two women above her in her family tree, and she fixed an oral narrative which might become yet more vulnerable given her lack of a direct line to pass it on to again. But more than this, she also garlanded her own legacy as a favoured niece, chosen to preserve this object. Ultimately, the quilt has survived within the matrilineal family for 300 years, passing between as many as 7 generations of daughters and nieces who have heeded the note and recognised the quilt's importance in the telling of their female-centric family story. Of course, girls who understood the painstaking labour involved in the making of complex textiles might better value the objects. Equally, women who valued leaving a legacy had a vested interest in making sure that there was someone in the family who would appreciate and preserve the object of their labour. Catherine Hutton and her aunt passed their visit making her a cap. Jane Austen encouraged her nieces to sew. Needlework as a shared practice could cement emotional bonds, but it also taught a reverence for the needle's toil. Girls who were raised in a family tradition of meaningful making were also likely to go on to assign meaning to their own needlework production. Aunt Perkins learnt to sew as a young girl, described as living with cross old aunts, who ran a milliner's shop and a general store in Leicestershire. After her girlhood sewing with her aunt, Catherine went on to become a prolific maker of quilts. She lists them, aged 89, in an account of her life's achievements. She says, "I have quilted counterpanes and chest covers in fine linen in various patterns of my own invention. I have made patchwork beyond calculation, from 7 years old to 85. 2 extant quilts, one which you can see there in the slide, were made by Catherine, which was subsequently acquired by Birmingham Museums after being located within the family after the Guild event. This quilt actually also has a label on the back significantly, which says the work of Catherine Hutton, 1804. So she was already recording her items to herself. Despite the Huttons' public historical profile, both father and daughter wrote published memoirs still studied. These extant quilts remained until the succession unknown outside of the family and unrecognised as valuable items of female biography and history. The calico quilt still remains in private ownership. But when domestic textiles move from being objects of oral family history into objects of recorded cultural history in a museum, there is of course always a risk that new assumptions are made which privilege dominant and in the past often patriarchal narratives and obscure the stories of their female makers. Two complex patchwork quilts at the Tully House Museum in Cumbria were connected in their original 1950s accession record to the Dickinsons of Redhow, a prominent patrilineal line of magistrates and justices from a large local house. However, further research shows that instead, this is a very different female-focused story about the use of needlework by the two Hodgson sisters, Anne, born in 1803, and her older sister Hannah, born in 1796, who both married into less elite yeoman farming branches of the family. Their sisterly bond, expressed in needlework, went on to be shared with their nieces. These two quilts allow us to illuminate these women's complex matrilineal network and its influence on their life path. The role of aunt was, of course, predicated in the formative bonds of sisters, often forged in shared schoolroom needlework, a practice which could continue in social sewing throughout a lifetime. Anne and Hannah probably learnt to sew together, and certainly Anne Rawling, née Hodgson, was still stitching at the age of 80 in 1883, making this quilt we can see here, annotating her extant quilt with initials and age as a legacy to a long lifetime of industriousness. Yet Anne's only son predeceased her by more than 50 years. So who was the audience for this later life legacy piece, and how did it come to be preserved? The second quilt in the collection offers us some clues. This complex frame diamond is dated around 1850 and was attributed only to one of the Miss Dickinsons of Kidburn-Gill, now established as likely Esther or Jane Dickinson, both unmarried daughters of Hannah Dickinson, née Hodgson, so Anne's sister. Clearly, both aunt and nieces were accomplished quilt makers. Analysis of the details of the sisters' lives reveals that Anne and Hannah lived intimately connected lives, both marrying farmers who lived less than 2 miles apart. Anne was bereaved of her only son when he was 12, whereas Hannah went on to have 9 children, including 3 sets of twins. The original patriarchal surname attribution meant that the connection between these young women makers and their quilt-making maternal aunt, Anne Rowling, was not clear. However, the 1851 census return even captures a domestic visit between the 22-year-old Esther and her aunt Anne. Were they working on a quilt together? Certainly, it seems likely that Anne was a regular part of her nieces' lives. When Anne's husband William died, she lived on for another 3 decades in the home of a third niece, Esther and Jane's older married sister, Hannah. Perhaps the quilts passed to Hannah's children or grandchildren, and through that line, but further work to link the 2 separate 1950s donors to the original makers continues. Nevertheless, the quilts can now be reunited as linked family pieces. Quilts evade the neat distinctions of historical periodization. The materiality of the quilts instead offers an emotional layering of generational influences and fabrics. The inscription at the centre of the log cabin quilt, while sewn in 1880, is a practice more reminiscent of embroidered sampler assertions from Anne's girlhood in the first decades of the 19th century. A potent fulcrum of associations coalesce around domestic textiles as inherited items of identity and memory. There is, of course, first the powerful bond of needlework with femininity. There is the connection of the patchwork quilt with notions of maternal or domestic care. And then there is also the place of the quilt in the bed, itself a symbol of the transformation of female identity into wife or mother, and a place of both power and vulnerability at birth and death. All aspects which gave quilts a particularly significant place in inherited expressions of female identity and history. I wanted to leave you with a final thought. Needlework is often stubbornly linked to notions of feminine conventionality, and inheritance stories can overlook women like today's aunt who did not have a child to keep their objects for us to analyse. In reconnecting their relationships through the things that they made, we strive to build greater clarity about the emotional realities of their lives. I therefore would have done a grave injustice to the indomitable Aunt Perkins if I did not clarify that she was no docile needleworker. Having abandoned her husband after a short few months of marriage to live alone, she supported herself spinning and running a private haberdashery shop from her parlour. She is described by her niece as having a spirit of dominion which drew every human being round her into its vortex. Born with talents to command an empire, yet she was more beloved than feared. Her entirely domestic legacy is symptomatic of the limitations of the world in which she stitched, yet she used the agency that needlework gave her to claim her independence and preserve her lineage through the strategic inheritance of her quilt. Anne Rawling also had no living child, but secured her legacy through her warm relationship with her nieces, expressed in their quilts. Ultimately, the study of objects such as quilts offers an intimate alternative lens to explore women's emotional histories, mapped in the practical ways in which they acted to preserve their stitch legacy as an inheritance in the next generation and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic, and it's just so lovely to see the objects, and indeed all of the objects that we've had shared with us today. Thank you so much. Okay, so we can open up now to some discussion, questions, etc. There's been some comments already in the chat, but what I will do is I'm going to change my view so that I can see everyone and see any hands that might be raised. Okay, so can I, oh, Hannah, you go ahead, please.
Yeah, I found those other papers great, and I know we're always tempted to look for continuities, especially to tie everyone else's work up with our own, or I am anyway. But I found both the gifting of books and the annotation or lack of annotation within books really resonant with the 18th century. I thought Kath also raised a really interesting issue that Kate and I have talked about a bit as well, about how one's own faith or lack of faith, and even if you see yourself as an atheist, your own upbringing, in my case, primitive Methodist, can you believe, or actually probably you can believe, how that influences, you know, your kind of attitude to your own sources. And Deborah, I was really interested in the stuff on quilts, and I should say that the other thing that we've been looking at in our project are samplers. And other forms of embroidery, and there are other places where people make their mark. I thought I'd just mention to you, in case you find it interesting, that one of my colleagues, Stefan Hans, who's an early modernist, has done some work using microscopy to look at embroidery and even analysing religious meanings in the number of stitches used with biblical resonances, and I can give you that reference if you want. So I found that really fascinating. Anyway, I'll shut up now and let other people talk.
Thank you, Hannah, for those for sharing that. That was really quite remarkable to think that the actual counting stitches to convey meaning and of course, who the audience is there is the audience God, because who else?
The audience is God, but the audience is also, I guess, the other thing I was thinking when Debbie was talking. Sorry if you are a Deborah was talking, is the pious act of making in and of itself. That's the main audience. I think could just be the stitcher.
Thank you. I'm just looking across the screen here to see if anyone else has raised a hand. Alison, I think you're next.
Hi. Those are three fascinating papers, but I'm very interested in the thread that goes through, and something that you just said, Hannah, as well, how religious background can affect you. And I wonder with Kath, I mean, my mother came from a very strict Baptist family. And when she married my father, she converted to Church of England. But when she died back in March, my brother and I decided that she never really became a member of the Church of England. And so we actually asked a Baptist minister to take her funeral. But I find with me that I have inherited an awful lot of her sort of nonconformist attitude. And it sort of made me almost not anti-Church of England, but I'm not into ritual in a big way. Despite being a historian. And I wonder whether you Kath, was saying about you're not so Catholic, or, you know, do you find that it's almost a rebellion against what you were brought up as?
I think it was. I think when I was sort of 13, 14, I wanted to reject absolutely everything to do with Catholicism. I thought it was evil. I sort of walked away from it. even though I was still going to Catholic school, I remember writing stuff in the sort of GCSE mock, and my RE teacher saying, well, that might be what you think, Catherine, but that's not what the church thinks. So, you know, you might feel that that's right, but you're not going to get an A if you do that. But yeah, so what I would say is my attitude towards it has changed. It's softened. I still think that a lot of the things that the Catholic Church does is, yeah, I'm not happy with them. But what I find interesting is that my mother also isn't happy with them, and has always not been happy with them generally. And so I've started to see that my relationship to Catholicism is now mostly about what I think it did give me as a child, which was about community. It was about ideas about social justice, actually, which I think doesn't really come out very much when people talk about Catholicism, but there's a whole range of different positions in Catholicism, and social justice is really important. So I do think that I feel more warmly towards it, less of a rejection, but I also see what the emphasis on original sin and guilt has done to the women in my family generally. And I think it's only as I sort of break free of that I'm able to look at Catholicism in a different way and see what they got from it that was good, as well as what they got from it that was perhaps less healthy.
What I did find very interesting actually was the fact that your grandmother had put the thing in, the Aaron's blessing, as they call it, may the Lord keep you, because that was the blessing my mother wanted at my father's funeral, and so my brother and I put it at her funeral as well. And it is known as I don't know whether the Catholics is, but it's known as Aaron's blessing. And when I mentioned that to the Baptist minister who took the service, he said, oh yes, I always use that. I put my child to bed every night, and I say that to him and I put him to bed. So I thought that was interesting, that was going across religious boundaries. That's wrong, but you know, it's going from, it's just general through the idea that it's more of a preservation of the person necessarily than religion.
And I just wanted to very quickly say that my knowledge of the Bible is absolutely awful. And actually part of that is because Catholics aren't as interested in the Bible as a lot of people are. It's more about the Mass and the liturgy, or that's how I've always felt it, and about the rosary and everything. That the Bible itself, it doesn't play as much of a role. Of course it does, but not as much of a role as other faiths. So I find that interesting as well. So anyway.
Thank you. Sorry, thank you.
It's quite, you know, it's just fascinating to also see through this the way in which, again, just referring back to Hannah, in which some of these objects are acting as agents themselves. They might be specifically around a Bible or a religious book and the interleavings, but also then of course about the stories that are told within a family or resurfaced, shall we say, in a family at particular points in life. So I think that really does sort of speak back to your paper, Hannah, on the way that these objects will act upon those that encounter them, and for several generations after, and of course then with another afterlife in public arenas too. So that's fantastic. Now I see that we have another 2 questions, so we'll go to Helen first and then to Andrew. I think that was the correct order that I saw, well, at least the order I saw them.
My point's a little bit broader really, but kind of picking up on what Kath was starting to say about, you know, her engagement, but I'm a historian, and I'm wrestling with this kind of question of taking a personal family subject and offering it as an academic proposition. And so I'm looking for help really with my literature review here. But I was interested in a number of the talks where people are working with family material. They seem to be doing it in more creative and literary arenas, and whether it's more difficult to make the case for it being worthwhile as history, as, you know, bigger history. And I just wondered what people's thoughts were on that.
Sorry, can I just quickly, this is the first time I've ever done anything on my family. I've never tried to write about it in any form like this. I think I couldn't at the moment. I could physically do it, but I don't feel able to add lots of footnotes and make it historiographical. For a couple of reasons. I feel weird about exploiting my family. It feels like exploiting the stories of my family for professional reasons. I don't think it is that, but I just feel a little bit odd about it. And also, it's very much my reading. I was very careful that it's my reading of my grandmother's Bible. It wouldn't necessarily be what my cousins felt about it, or, you know, and there's that side of it. So that sort of has stopped me from doing anything with it before. I'd say if you're interested in literature, look at Alison Light's work, definitely, if you haven't already. And also Julia Lay, I think, has done some really great stuff on this as well. But your people here will know more than I do. But I think there's something still stopping me from doing it as an academic thing. And I think if I do write it, it is going to be much more of a semi-creative non-fiction thing.
Thanks, Kath. That's really interesting because, of course, I mean, one of the things that we're you know, I think we're at is it a turning point? We're at a point in time where I think that actually explicitly acknowledging one's own place in one's research, whether that one's own emotions, subjectivity, family as a sort of prompt and inspiration, is so much more, you know, done now and acceptable now. I really don't think that there are any problems about you know, these foundations and connections that we build on, as long as we you know, work through them and understand them and incorporate them to our analysis. So I think it's an exciting time actually to be a historian. I don't know if either of the other speakers want to reflect on that at all either. Or Katie, go ahead, Katie.
Well, I just wanted to say there that I teach students to do this. So I have a course called Family, Memory and Identity, and they pick a family, and they don't have to pick their own, but the majority pick their own family. And so that's what we do, is they bring in their records every week, and we think through how they fit into various historical narratives, largely around family life, but also around national memory and various types of identity. So that's the work that we do in that classroom, is to think about, well, how do we take these family stories and extrapolate them into other histories, and what does that mean? And interestingly, in the book that I'm kind of writing around that at the moment, has a whole chapter on historians and their uses of their family to create national histories of themselves, but also like the way the historians, when they write family histories, never go, it's just about me. They always go, and the implications are. And thinking about why and how we do that as a process. So I think these are really interesting questions, but I think it's also a space where people are doing that work and thinking it through. But if you want a reading list, I can provide if anybody wants to email me.
Sorry, I was just going to jump in and say that I think historians have actually been doing it a lot longer than we think. If you think about Caroline Steedman in the 1980s, you know, using her family, I think perhaps it's much more mainstream and people feel that they're able to do it more routinely, perhaps, than in the past. But I think people have actually been bringing it in for quite a while, I would say.
Yes, that's absolutely true. I just think there's been a kind of nervousness about it for some of us. I think you have to be pretty confident in the past to do that, and you know, without being perhaps, you know, more criticised than or at least some of us would have feared that. Okay, thank you for that question, Helen. Was there anything else on that one, or shall I move to our next?
I was just going to say, you have to be pretty confident if you're about your own family relationships. I love my family, but I'm not sure how they would feel about me writing about them, which is why I love to be an 18th centuryist and have a bit of distance. But I did it made me remember that when my mother died, she had an archive that went to the Feminist Library at University of Leeds, and I had to sort through my own mother's archive and came across some letters that I was quite uncomfortable about. And it was such a strange moment as a historian to think my instinct was to put them in the bin, but the historian, you know, and obviously because I work in libraries, I knew I could just slap a 50-year rule on it. So that's what I did. But the impulse is very strong within your own family. It's an interesting dynamic for me.
Let's just say that there are other stories that I wouldn't tell. This one is quite a nice one. But yeah, there are others.
I mean, it's quite interesting, of course, the ethical considerations of all of this, and you know, I've seen those ethical issues raised elsewhere, and I think sometimes you know, the complexities of the histories of the family and all of its forms do probably mean that we could perhaps pay more heed to that, and not just about our own families. Alison, did you want to come in on that one specifically before I move to Andrew? Who's been very patient.
Because obviously, anyone who was there when I gave my paper, it was a very personal one. It was this family archive that I'd found. And yeah, there were, even though I told the story of my great-great-grandfather who ran away to sea and ended up as a gold digger, there are other stories in the family that connected with my grandfather that I didn't think I should share. And I'm also very conscious that my brother is a very, very private person. So I'm not sure how he would have been okay with what I told, because that's sort of out there. My mother used to talk about that, but I'm not sure some of the other things that I didn't talk about, he wouldn't have wanted me to say them, without a doubt. So yeah, it does put you in a strange position. I've got this lovely archive. I'd love to write something about it, but I think I might write it some other time when it's not a year yet since my mother died, so since we got over that. But I'm quite with Kath. There are things I didn't say which you might have found very interesting, but you'll just have to wait.
We look forward to that, Alison. Okay, thank you, Andrew. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Sorry, firstly, I should say that I lost my voice yesterday after teaching, so apologies if I sound a little strangulated. But thank you very much to all the speakers. I really was very fascinated about all the papers and the ways that they came together. I was really interested in the topics because I wrote a while ago about a christening gown, which we christened my daughter in. It was a piece of Ayrshire whitework, which is we can date it as far as 1862. And my grandmother and her mother and all the rest were christened in it. And very recently, sadly, when my grand's brother passed away, I inherited a family Bible. And it was one of the reasons I was so interested in finding out more about some of these things. And it was my maternal grandmother's mother. It was her family Bible. Now, the interesting thing for me was, again, I think people were talking earlier on, I think we've covered all the confessional kind of varieties. They're all from the west coast of Scotland, from near Skye. And they're all wee free, all very austere. But the Bible is a Gaelic Bible, and it was bought with the remains of my grand's uncle's regimental pay when he was killed in the First World War. And again, my grandmother's mother has recorded all of the names of family in the pages, which is why I then became interested, and why I thought it was so interesting to see these papers come together with, of course, the material kind of culture of that passing down and the kind of the adding to it and all the rest of it, but even the use of it. And before we christened my daughter, my gran, to clean the christening gown, wet it in the morning dew and hung it out in the sun to bleach it white again, as a way of trying to preserve it and make it useful. And then working through the Bible, which of course has all these strange, weird things about it. It's in Gaelic, which you would tend to associate perhaps with a more kind of Irish and Catholic, but then of course it is a Bible, which has been translated for people in the kind of usually kind of Church of Scotland and its kind of satellite churches as well. So there's a kind of odd kind of tension with that. I wondered about, earlier on, we mentioned, of course, the idea of different types of ritual, of course, and ideas of ritual and how they were used. And I thought, it was really interesting to hear in Hannah's paper that discussion of, them being repositories of memory and family histories, because they were held on to, they were valuable, they weren't to be sold or given away or anything like that. I then wondered a bit about that tension between what you were talking about there. And in Kath's example, that was a Bible that was used in a kind of daily basis, even as your remembrance priest's thing set out, it told you exactly how to use it. My experience, I think, like seeing the way that those Bibles were used in my own family, looking at my own family's Bibles, we were Presbyterian, is very much that they were sort of sitting in a cupboard. They were things that were preserved and kept for good, rather than sort of daily consulted and all the rest. And I wondered if you thought that changed it slightly in terms of the significance, the usage. Hannah spoke about, the marks of usage, the object biographies almost of these texts. And I wondered if you thought it changed the way that they're used across those different confessional divides. I guess that question goes to Kath and also to Hannah about how these things are used. Does it change or alter their meaning or significance as they are, I don't know, used differently across different faiths, perhaps? And I'm going to stop talking now before my voice goes completely. But thank you very much to everyone for your papers.
Okay, thank you for that really rich question. I think for me, what is interesting is I don't think this Bible was used daily, actually, because yes, she uses it as a repository of stuff, but I'm pretty 100% certain I know exactly where it was kept, which was in the drawer of her dressing table, because that's where she kept precious things. So there was jewelry in there and stuff like that, and photographs. So I'm pretty sure that that's where she kept it. I'm sure she looked at it often, but I don't think she used it on a daily basis. And those the preaching of the Redemptorist Father was mainly all about the rosary and doing the family rosary. So it was something that involved beads rather than the Bible. But I don't think she used it very much. It's not very worn. It's in very good condition for a relatively cheap Bible. And yeah, and what was interesting last night when I told my mum that I confessed to my mum that I was doing this paper, and she said, "Oh, have you got it? Have you got the Bible?" She'd forgotten that she'd given it to me, and I said, "Are you all right with that? Are you okay with me having it?" And she said, "Yes, because that means I don't have to find it." It was a responsibility to have the Bible in the house, so she was kind of glad to be free in a weird way of making sure she didn't lose it, which I find really interesting. So obviously I don't use it on an everyday basis. I find it odd that I'm using it now for what I'm using it for today. But actually, as I said before, I don't think the Bible was central to her daily practice. Not that the Bible didn't matter, but it was used differently.
I was just wandering around to look for my grandma's Bible, but I think it's downstairs. Okay, so most of the subjects we look at in the late 18th, early 19th century in our northern towns are Anglican or forms of nonconformity that you would expect, Methodism in particular. I think there's particular focus in nonconformity, of course, on the word and study of the word, but the Anglicans actually seem to do it just as much. I can't tell if there's a change, but I do know, for example, that when I see some later 19th century examples of Bibles in local record offices, that they start to print pages specifically for recording births, marriages and deaths in, which I find quite interesting, that the publishers have responded to what they must see as a common usage. I also think, and I think this is something Kate and I have discussed, that you put your family history or your family names in the Bible, not just because it's the book that's least likely to get lost or it's a place of record, but literally to associate your family with the family of God as well. I think it's a special place to record these really important events. But then there's the kind of contradiction, which I don't think actually is a contradiction, that these books are used for other things as well. So I think there's lots going in there. I'm pretty sure, because I have a memory of it, that my grandma used her Bible on a daily basis, but then it's quite unusual to still be a practicing primitive Methodist in the 1970s and 1980s, when actually the Prims had rejoined the main Methodist church, but she still saw herself as a Prim. So that's quite unusual. And as you probably know, it's an austere form of Methodism, probably rather like your family in the West Coast. I do think there's probably lots to unpick there in what that Bible means and what it was doing. And just because I've talked about Bibles being everyday objects and sacred objects, it doesn't mean that in other contexts they're not seen primarily as sacred objects that are to be kept really safely and away. It's just there'll be different forms of usage. The other thing I just wanted to mention, which is a completely different thing, but we've talked a lot about inheritance and the passage of items through families. One thing that we found in our study, we looked at quite a lot of women's wills, and I've also worked quite hard, depending on how strict archivists and museum curators are, at trying to link particular objects with donors, working backwards so I can identify makers often. Things are quite often passed down through the female line, but they're quite often not, and passed down through the male line. And I guess the point I wanted to make is it seems the familial link is the most important there. And it's not something that's exclusively female.
Thank you, Hannah. That's interesting, and I do think there's some work to be done there on again also how the stories are told around inheritances, because yes, you're right. I think male bequests are probably important, but I do wonder if there are also kinds of intangible stories that are created around them, which seem to perhaps be more feminine. I don't know, that's entirely speculation. I wanted to go to, Debs has got her hand raised, because I was just going to also ask Deb if she wouldn't mind saying something about scripture quilts as well here, because I think that has some real resonances with just that question.
Yes, I was actually just going to talk about male inheritance first, because it's working in an area which is normally seen as being very female dominated. So there's the assumption that things like domestic textiles get passed from woman to woman. But actually in my work, I found a lot of examples of men passing things either onto sons expressly saying in remembrance of your mother. So the item was still associated with a woman, but it was passed from man to man, or indeed, things passing through male lines just as an item which was about the family name, and that the textile could still be that rather than just associated with a woman. So it is much more complex than just being women, I think. And I think by looking at something like textiles, which is so concentrated in a kind of female-centric kind of world of inheritance, you actually get to see that. Yes, scripture quilts. Well, I mean, and this has been fascinating for me because I don't know an awful lot about Bibles, but I know an awful lot about scripture quilts. I've been looking a lot at whether scripture quilts are purely, so I think in the kind of quilt world they've tended to be, and textile world, they've tended to be looked at as items of religious communication, and I've been looking at them as items of emotional communication, so looking at how the use of the scripture allows people to present other messages. So people using specific scripture passages to express something that has happened personally in their life. I mean, I'm particularly thinking about examples of quilts which were made to reflect the loss of a child, and so the items that have been chosen, the words that have been chosen, are words of consolation, and so you do see that reflected in textiles as well. I mean, it's a really interesting dynamic between, you know, words and things that we're talking about today, because quilts are often thought about as being items that are textured rather than textural, but often they also have words, you know, associated with them, either embroidered or written words on the back once indelible ink became available in the 19th century. So there are lots of parallels I'm finding listening today.
Thank you for that. Now I'm going in the order of hands that were raised, and Carmen had raised her hand in the chat, Carmen Mankin, so I will hand over to her, and then I think it's Kate and then Kath.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed all three papers, and I've got some small comments and then I want to end on a bigger question, kind of methodological, but and forgive me, the internet went in and out, so I may have missed something, but I was thinking of Kath's Bible. I'm sorry, the Bible seems to have resonated with many of us. You know, I mean, I felt in a way that it was kind of transgressive because it's not a Catholic Bible, and she's kept it. So it was really kind of, I found that really fascinating. I mean, I don't know much about Bibles, and I don't know what a Catholic Bible is, but I know particularly at that time it would have been different than a Protestant Bible. So I just found that really interesting that she kept it, and even if she didn't read it, you know, obviously it does had some power, and I mean, I don't mean that in a bad way, but I mean just the emotive power, perhaps, is something that she wants to keep. But I wonder too if it had something to do with the relationship with the person who gave it to her. So it may not simply be about religion, but maybe as much, or maybe it is. But anyways, that relationship. And yeah, I'm just going to say everything all, and then you can comment on whatever you want. With regards to the photo of your mom in 1967, which I loved, you know, this idea of there are, and Alana Harris's work points to this, but of course and even my own work, these generational shifts in the understanding of Catholicism, which start really in the 1950s rather than just Vatican Council. But there is a sense that there comes a point, I think, where it becomes, well, at least to some, acceptable to have this really kind of contested relationship with Catholicism. Not to everyone, most certainly, but to some, and certainly Humanae Vitae in 1968, the point where the Pope says no birth control, and the point where priests, sisters, laity say, this isn't okay now. So, you know, you see that in a public way. There's a great oral history article, I'm just, you know, that kind of addresses the ethics of interviewing your family, for example. And it's in the Oral History Society journal, and it's titled something like, "If I had known you were going to ask me about the 60s, I wouldn't have spoken to you." And it's a great article. And yeah, okay. And then my kind of methodological questions, okay, is this history of emotions link. You know, do we infer these links? You know, are we? How legitimate is it, I guess, I think this is my question, to infer these emotional links based on these, you know, whether it's drawing images in a Bible or keeping it and putting items in it. I mean, I guess, how do we substantiate that? And I'm thinking in particular, I'm working on a paper on memory, on collective memory of a group of nuns. You won't be surprised to hear that. but they are trying to get back these objects. So I'm not sure how to understand if there's an emotional connection with those objects that they have never had, but their predecessors, who they consider part of the family, have had. I'm sorry, that's it, but I'm sorry I spoke too long.
Shall I start?
Yes, please go ahead.
So first of all, I think you're right. I was really surprised actually when I first saw this Bible, because she was such a devout Catholic, like so Catholic. And it was surprised me anyway that she hadn't always been. But then, yes, it's a King James Bible. I mean, it says, you know, this is a British and Foreign Bible Society on Queen Victoria Street. This is like the most British thing you can have. So yeah, I think that's probably one of the reasons it was in the dressing table. But I think you're absolutely right, because when my mum's like hardly looked at this Bible. I have to be quite honest with you. She doesn't have the relationship with it that I do. But when I said, oh, it was given to her by E. Shepherd, she said, oh, Miss Shepherd, she talked about Miss Shepherd all the time. So clearly that was a really important thing for her. And I think education, actually, it's as much about education as it is about religion. And I also see that my mum's career, which was getting her Catholic teaching certificate and all that before its degree, and then becoming a head teacher of a Catholic school. My nana had a really interesting relationship with that, because she was very proud of the fact that she'd had this career. But you know, you're leaving these children to be wild. you're not bringing up the children enough. You're not there enough. And so there was that tension there, which I always think really interesting. I can't remember what the second bit was.
A generational change. But yeah, that was more of a comment.
Shall I answer the second bit, Carmen? It's something we've thought about as well. There is some inference in terms of, especially when you're talking about making and the labour involved. But we've also looked at wills and the care with which people delineate what they want left to certain people. That's a quite good indication, I think, of the kind of, at least the importance and the emotional importance of things that are often of quite low value in terms of selling them. We have found a few glimpses of people talking about objects of a woman receiving a couple of pictures as a bequest, religious pictures, and saying she wanted to cry with joy. So there's enough. We've been lucky to find a few little snippets, but I know what you mean. You really want people to talk about about things. But that's what we've done in our project. Kath just raised something that I wanted to say more so something about in our project more generally is, I think one of the things that Kate and I have found surprising in our project, doing a kind of social history approach to religion, is how far the confessional divides that you expect to be so important seem far less important than we were expecting. And one of the things that towns do is allow people to shop around, and people often will worship at lots of different places. And I don't want to be too simplistic. We're not presenting a kind of homogenous, one size fits all Christianity in our project, but many of the ways that ordinary people practice their faith seem to be not so much to do with the kind of theological divide that, if you read a lot of church history, you would expect to be very central to people's lives.
I would say Manchester in the mid-20th century is not about a theological divide. Actually get on very well. I get that impression. It's social. It's massively social because of the large number of Irish immigrants. My other side is Irish immigrants, which is interesting because they only meet. My mother's family and my father's family only meet because of the church. There was
Yeah.
no other way that they would have met. One is very white collar, one is very manual worker, one is Irish immigrant, one is shopkeeper's daughter, and they meet through this. So yeah, I think it's more social than it is theological.
Yes, but that divide that you've just described is people having the same confessional from different social groups, actually, which is what I would say also happens to a certain extent. Although, for example, you would associate Unitarians with more a kind of acquisitive type of people perhaps than mainstream Methodism, but not necessarily. Anyway, I'll shut up now.
Thank you, everyone. I think we have 2 more questions which we should be able to squeeze in before the end of our session. So Kate, you were next. Thanks for your patience.
Thanks. I have a really quick question for Deborah, and then a kind of broad, what do we do about this problem / question. So for Deborah, is there something special about quilts in that they are so tactile and you use them very close to the body and you sleep under them? Is there something, I'm kind of thinking about the balance between something being decorative and usable, and I've worked a lot on clothing being handed down and clothing that's not, that is worn very close to the body, and that about being a very tactile remembrance of a person. And so whether quilts are different to other types of needlework that are perhaps more decorative and that you wouldn't use in such a physical way. And then a kind of broad, massive question of, in a lot of what we've been talking about in terms of family and objects, is there a risk of us privileging blood relationships because they're easy for us to find, because we can do the genealogy, so we can trace people back? Whereas if Miss Shepherd hadn't handily left that little note, you would have no connection between Miss Shepherd and your Nana, Kath. And so I think a lot about families that are constituted in different ways and the importance of friends, and especially for single people or people who don't have children, and that emotional legacy being more important. And I have a lot of examples of this, but that's because I look a lot at wills, and they say, oh, I'm giving this particular book to my best friend because she lent me a book once and I'm now giving it back to her, all this kind of stuff. And is that a more general kind of methodological problem for historians like us who work on family and objects?
Shall I start with the quilt question? That's a huge question, a lovely one. Yes. So quilts intersect with, clothing. We see lots of pieces of clothing used in quilts. Sometimes we can actually even see what the shape of the garment was. So certainly on the backs of quilts, so a quilt is like a sandwich, 3 layers, and the back is normally a single piece of fabric. Sometimes that piece of fabric is pieced from different items. So there's a particularly famous quilt called the 1718 coverlet, which is a quilt which is silk on the front, but the back is made of linen. And it's actually, the back is pieced from the shapes of the shift. So, how you construct a shift out of a single piece with the kind of gussets under the arms, you can actually see how the construction. It also has the cross-stitched mark of the initials of the name, so the laundry mark. So certainly, is that significant, or is that just people using fabric that was available? It's very difficult. It's back to that question of inferring. Quilts, are they more important or are they different? I think we see both sorts. So some quilts, one of the kind of big dilemmas is that the quilts that exist for us to look at are quilts that probably weren't used very much. And so does that mean they have more or less meaning than the ones that got used up because they were on beds and were loved and washed and created? So there's a tension between those two things. Certainly, I think there's definitely that connection that I talked about between, the bed and the intimate kind of element of use, which, again, you're reflecting in things like, garments that were worn close to the skin. And I think there's a kind of haptic element to that in terms of how people respond to the textiles. Certainly it's a different thing to a sampler that is on a wall, a quilt that covers a body. Although again, having said that, again, we see parallels there. So we see things like samplers included in quilts. I mean, the beauty of a quilt, I think, is its ability to draw in all of these different things, because it was essentially an item of sometimes recycling, not always, but sometimes, it was almost a reflection of what was valued in the home, because it was reused, so it was important enough to be reused. Sometimes that's to do with the value of the fabric. I mean, the quilt that I showed you, the calico quilt, that would have been an expensive fabric at the time. And so, potentially that would have had a value outside of its emotional value, although obviously they reference its emotional value in the label. So no, I mean, I personally feel like the thing about the quilt is that it is also an item similar to a sampler, but slightly differently, which is made over a long period of time. So part of the meaning comes as well as the items that go into it, but the associations that it kind of picks up as it's being made, because these were projects that women embarked on that they expected to take a number of years. And that also required lots of different processes. So, the gathering of fabric was one kind of emotional and practical undertaking. The choice of pattern, and there was a mention in the comments about there's a lovely exhibition at the moment at the Bowes Museum in the north of England, which is whole cloth quilts. So quilts that were not made of patchwork, little bits of fabric, but single pieces. But the significance of the patterns that were sewn onto those were regional. So you could also overlay, as well as personal meaning, there was also regional meaning and kind of community meaning. So they're a unique canvas, I suppose, for the overlaying of lots of different messages and their longevity. So just the very practical nature of how they're created, 3 layers stitched through in order to make something very durable. They just have the opportunity to pick up a lot of meaning, as they go through generations. And that was why it was nice to talk about them today, because, they are very much items that were alongside people's lives for a long time within families. And part of that, I guess, is their significance. So, yeah.
Thank you, Deb. I'm aware that we're heading towards running out of time, and I guess I'm sort of going to leave Kate's big question there a little bit in the open, except that what I think I'm seeing is that there's a much greater recognition of those sorts of relationships which are not necessarily rooted in blood. They might be connections through marriage, which also is another form of family that we recognize, but there are a lot of, I think, satisfyingly, there are more scholars now who are, like yourself, looking at those other kinds of links and recognizing, we're queering families, aren't we? And that can be a range of different types of relationships which constitute some form of marriage or family, or so, I think that's where we're heading. That's a question we should all be probably tackling and thinking about. And we've got a final question, I think, from Kath. So forgive me if anyone else wanted to raise anything.
It's a very, very quick thing. And I just wanted to say how good it was to hear about ants in a really positive way as well. Because often when we talk about ants and inheritance, it's about being at the end of the line. And it sometimes seems a bit sad. But I was thinking, well, I don't have any children. Where am I going to give this Bible? Obviously, I'm going to give it to my niece. I'm going to give it to my niece, not only because she's my niece, but because I'm making a positive decision to give it to her because she's an RE teacher in a Catholic school. And it feels like it should, it makes sense to. So perhaps we could think about these inheritances with ants as something that's positive. It's not about loss, it's not about lack of something, but something that is meaningful and important. It's not just there's nowhere else for it to go. But that was just a thought.
That is a really important point, Kath, and I think one of the things that I'll pick up with Katie actually is one of the things I've noticed about all of our workshops is quite often people say, I don't have any children to hand this on to, and then something else. And of course, why culturally, in a way, we're expressing that as a problem, but this isn't. And I think that also ties into Kate's question too, of course, about it's the way that we see these relationships, and we ought to be seeing them differently. And equally, I've got this thing that I so want to do about grandmothers and the way they inspire academics, or academics seem to be inspired by grandmothers, and perhaps also by aunts. So thank you very much, everyone. I appreciate your time, and thanks so much to our wonderful speakers for their great talks today. I will just quickly end by reminding you that our final session is actually due to people's calendars on Monday, a little bit sooner than we normally have it. And this has 4 speakers, and we will be talking about scrapbooks, snapshots and albums, changing emotional meanings. So again, thank you very much for all of your input. It's been fascinating as ever. So I will close the meeting now. Thank you. Bye-bye then.
Thank you.